The sitting is resumed.
Order number 4, sir. Order number 4, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, and which shall be signed to Senator Manuel Knight, to move the passing of a resolution to approve, in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, compulsory acquisition by the state of a parcel of land situated at Balls Plantation in the parish of Christchurch in this island for a public purpose, namely the erection of a water storage tank by the Barbados Water Authority.
Senator Dr. Manuel Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the government has been trying assiduously to address the issues relating to the provision of quality water to citizens and also to service the needs of businesses, including agriculture. Mr. President, this is a difficult thing in the context of addressing these water issues. In recent years, I think we all can attest to the fact that there have been some communities that have been suffering perhaps a little bit more acutely than others in the context of not having running water coming through their taps, Mr. President, for as long, in some communities, as 4 months or more. And that has greatly affected them, their families, children, the elderly, etc. Mr. President, I have family members in the area of St. John and families that consist of small babies, people within the family that are asthmatic, and all sorts of conditions, you know, women who have to bathe and go to school and go to work and all of these different things. And so we understand that these issues in relating to water outages can create a great level of discomfort for people at a variety of different levels. Mr. President, there's a suggestion that perhaps, as Barbadians would say, for hardback men, it may not be so such a challenge as for the rest of the communities. But it is something that the government has been attempting to address. And even in the context of the government's plans to expand the agricultural sector, agriculture is one of the great users of water, so that the impact of addressing this issue of dealing with it is one that for all of us within the society is extremely important. The challenge, however, Mr. President, is two-part. The first part really has to do with the context of climate change, which is more acute as Barbados, as we know, is a water-scarce country. It is actually noted as the 15th water-scarce country in the entire world. Yeah, we are water-scarce, Mr. President. And to put it even further into context, I want to note that our annual rainfall, Mr. President, is 1,422 milliliters. Annual rainfall, 1,422 milliliters. And that, Mr. President, is concentrated within the rainy season from June to December. In the context now of climate change, what we have is a shortened rainy season that is happening. And not only that, you have a shortened rainy season. You also have now extreme weather events. So even though we have lots of rain, it also means flooding. And that then creates other problems, Mr. President. So a water-scarce country, and we are able to get our water from groundwater sources, Mr. President, so that if we don't get that rainfall consistently and that we are able to harvest, then we are all going to be in problems. It has implications, Mr. President, for all of us. During the dry season as well, Mr. President, our rainfall can be as low as 25 milliliters a month. Imagine that. 25 milliliters a month for this island. So that it requires then for the government, the Barbados Water Authority, to make sure that it can engage in creative ways in order to be able to service the needs of all of the citizens. And that is why there has been a continued focus, Mr. President, on the whole issue of water conservation. And we get upset when we are told that we can't use the hose to clean our cars and wet our gardens and all of these things. And we treat to it as if government is attempting to deny us of something that is fundamental, and that the government is deliberately imposing an inconvenience on us, as opposed to recognizing that if we continue to use the water that we have in the way that we are doing, we are going to have significant difficulties, particularly, Mr. President, in the context, as I said, of climate change. Mr. President, so much so that there are those who suggest that the issue of climate is really a water crisis. There are some, Mr. President, and the analysis that would suggest that declining rainfall patterns, the inability for us to be able to conserve water scarcity and drought will become one of the biggest health challenges that we will face as a human population. And so that, in the context of this small island state and looking at the issue of water scarcity, climate change presents a real challenge. The other challenge, Mr. President, has to do with the fact that we have an aging infrastructure. Our pipes, Mr. President, go back, so I'm saying, Mr. President, our pipes now, some of the pipes now that we are channeling our water to, were laid during the 1850s. The 1850s. Aging infrastructure, Mr. President, that then we are now trying to channel our scarce water resources. So, of course, as you do that, you're going to have pipes that are going to leak, they're going to break, they're going to need repairs, etc. And right across the entire system, in terms of water storage tanks, in stations, etc., there is a need for upgrades and improvement in the context of ensuring that we can have an adequate water supply, not only that it is adequate, Mr. President, but that it is safe as well for citizens. And that is indeed what the Barbados Water Authority is called to do. That is its mandate, to provide safe and adequate water for citizens and for businesses in order to be able to sustain the population and to sustain economic activity. But we have these challenges as I have identified them: the aging pipes, leakages right throughout the distribution network. We have occurrences of our faulty mains, corrosion due to saline intrusion. So again, in the context of climate change, as you have high sea level rises, you have greater propensity for intrusion, for saline intrusion. So these are some of the issues, Mr. President, that we have to be able to deal with and to be able to address in the context of the provision of water. So that we're saying, Mr. President, I'm outlining to you, a variety of challenges. But I'm also saying to you that the government is attempting to tackle these challenges and these issues through a variety of legislative and other regulatory policies as well as programs, Mr. President. And I would note that this administration, various administrations, have brought to bear a number of instruments. So, Mr. President, I refer to the water and land use zoning regulations around wastewater management, storm management and flood alleviation, ecosystem and nearshore water management. That is making sure that we are able to have our eye on the effluent that is then flowing into our coastal marine environment to make sure, again, that we are not damaging that as well. So that there are a number of different steps and processes that have to be in place as we attempt to address all of the challenges that we have in relation to this issue of the provision of water. And it is for this reason, Mr. President, that the Barbados Water Authority has thought very strategically to implement, I think it's almost a 20-year strategic plan. Because if you have pipes dating back to 1850s, this is not something that we can tackle in a one shot. It is not something that can be tackled within the context of a political cycle, Mr. President. It is something that you have to be able to address systematically over a period of time. And so in the context of a 20-year strategic plan, the Barbados Water Authority has been seeking very systematically and more intensified in this dispensation, Mr. President, if I may say, in order to be able to address these issues. Mr. President, I want to point to the recent $50 million project under the Green Climate Fund, of which 40 million of that was grants, Mr. President. Under this program that we call 3R Cruise, and which is really about reduce, reuse, and recycle water resources management. And a large part of that program will be education and building awareness for families, for communities, and for the nation of the importance of being able to ensure, again, that we use the water resources that we have effectively, to examine the issue of wastewater management, how we do that, how we can apply it, and to ensure that we are also able to address the issues of the effluent, of, I was saying, ensuring the quality of the effluent entering the marine environment, and also as well upgrading of wastewater treatment plants. And that is a significant project that the Barbados Water Authority will be undertaking as one of the initiatives in order to be able to address some of these challenges that we are having. There's another project, Mr. President, also approved through the Green Climate Fund. It's called the Water Sector Nexus for Sustainability in Barbados. And that is being provided through part grant funding and also as well under a separate program funded by the Caribbean Development Bank as well. But a really comprehensive program, multifaceted program, Mr. President, in order to allow the Barbados Water Authority to address some of the issues. And just, Mr. President, to just talk a little bit about that Water Sector Resilience Nexus for Sustainability project and some of the things that is intended to do. So one of the things, one of the main objectives for that is to build resilience in extreme storm events and drought conditions by utilizing cleaner energy resources. So again, tying the issue of water as well to energy as well. Because don't forget, Mr. President, as we are able to harvest the water, then it has to go through systems, it has to go to be pumped, etc. And those pumping stations rely on electricity. So in order to ensure that we will have a consistent and stable supply, one of the things that the Barbados Water Authority will be doing is the installation of photovoltaics systems in order to ensure then that we will not have an interrupted supply in the context of a storm. But this project will do more than that. It will also allow for the procurement of 5 1,500-gallon water tankers, a 5,000-gallon tank and tractor unit by the Barbados Water Authority. It would allow for the installation of 200 rainwater harvesting system, the installation of decentralized storage for a number of different areas, particularly for schools and healthcare facilities as well. Again, Mr. President, in an effort to ensure that we take care of the most vulnerable amongst us as well. And it will also allow for the development of a hydrogeological model and the retrofitting of suck wells for increased recharge of aquifers across the island. So, Mr. President, the picture that I am painting here is, again, that while we know that there are a number of challenges, and I believe that whether you are on the government side, the independent side, we can all point to at different times in households where we would have had challenges in the context of water. I live in the Christchurch area, Mr. President, and you sometimes don't necessarily associate water outages with certain areas. I remember one of the perhaps most interesting points in my marriage, and I'm sure that my husband is going to have a call as I mention this, was the whole discussion that we were having in terms of, installing a very kind of sophisticated system for making sure for water storage, etc. And I'm not going to say who was who on which side of the debate, but one side of this marriage, was arguing that this is Christchurch, man. Christchurch always has water, and, where are we going to spend this money and, put in all of this infrastructure because there's the propensity for, to have water outages for an extremely long period of time is extremely low. And then, Mr. President, the other side of the marriage was able to say, I told you so, because within a matter of months, there was a water outage for a period of time within that same area. But at the same time, Mr. President, on a serious note, I do think that one of the things that I was reflecting on, again, when we talk about culture and how we grow up and the need to conserve, was that we were still able to survive and address the situation because, as we have been taught, I had about 15 bottles of water stored somewhere in a cupboard, and then I still had a large container that was stored underneath the sink with water, yeah? But in many instances now, we are becoming, as we would usually are, very sophisticated in our developments, and those individual household things of how we store water and conserve water, we no longer necessarily, Mr. President, perhaps want to pay attention to. And certainly, in the context I was referencing of, using the hose to wash the car and wet the garden, that we need to become more conscious of how our individual usage impacts on that water scarcity and the ability for other citizens to have access to water, Mr. President. And so these are some of the things that the Barbados Water Authority will be attempting to address. I want again to reiterate the focus in all of these programs on public education and building awareness amongst citizens in terms of changing their habits, but also as well educating them on what are some of the ways that within their households, within the way that they manage the family, that they can also conserve water. Simple things, Mr. President, turning off the tap. And I am guilty of it because when I'm cooking and I'm scrubbing off the potatoes, I like to got the water running to just, make sure that them clean, especially the sweet potatoes and all of those things. When you're brushing your teeth, Mr. President, to turn off the water, Mr. President, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about nobody else because I'm guilty of doing all of those things, of making sure that you're measuring when you turn off the tap, of making sure that you have toilets, etc., that help to save water, and all of those things now are things that we are going to have to take on board as part of our lived reality in the context of the situation that we are facing. And so within that context and the work that the Barbados Water Authority is seeking to be able to do, I want, Mr. President, to note that outside of those projects, internally as well, the Barbados Water Authority is also concentrating on building capacity of the staff within the Water Authority in order to ensure that the efforts at efficiency are not only built in terms of repairs and upgrades, but if we do not build capacity amongst the staff to operate at a higher level, to be able to understand the needs for efficiency, faster response, greater customer service as well, then we will have a mismatch in the efforts. And so that one of the biggest areas, not biggest, but one of the big areas that the Water Authority is also focusing quite a bit on, Mr. President, is that issue of building capacity amongst its staff and doing training so that we can have those initiatives that I spoke about also running in tandem by ensuring that the staff are critical to maintenance overall. So that there are a number of goals that the Barbados Water Authority are seeking to be able to achieve. And in the context of the project that I spoke about, that was in part funded by the Caribbean Development Bank, we note that the intent is to be able to ensure that we are able to upgrade water production and distribution facilities as well, which would also see the refurbishment of a number of limestone reservoirs, the replacement of 7 steel water storage tanks, and the replacement of approximately 30 kilometers of water mains, the installation of photovoltaic systems, and the preparation of a water sector climate change adaptation master plan, and assessment of the gendered impacts of water outages, and the conduct of a cost of service study and tariff review. Mr. President, I want to just spend a little bit on this discussion in terms of the assessment of the gender-related impacts of water outages. When I was a consultant, I had the privilege of working in St. Lucia with the Water Authority there and doing a gender-related impact on the water sector. And it was very interesting because when we started that consultancy, there was a bit of a reticence because certainly while this was something that the management wanted to do, the staff necessarily didn't understand fully why in the context of water we were dealing with the issues of gender. Why was that important? How did that factor in? How did it impact on the work that they had to do? And so we had to go in and work with the agency for over 8 months, doing a lot of capacity building and workshops with the staff, helping them to understand that even in the context of having a water outage, but not necessarily allowing people to know beforehand, and particularly women, upfront beforehand, had a real negative impact on the household. We did a survey that showed that particularly, as we've discussed here, for vulnerable populations, for children, particularly, and the elderly, who women had responsibility for care of, that it severely impacted their ability to be able to run their households, and that all that was simply needed was a better customer service injection where at least people will be given notice of either a cutoff or potential water outage so that they could be prepared. So that it was those kinds of small nuances that needed to be appreciated. And you would see here, Mr. President, I hope that we can all attest that there has been some improvement in the context of the Barbados Water Authority, given notices on potential water outages, etc. Might not be perfect, but there has been an attempt in order to improve the communication to the public on those issues, Mr. President, and particularly in the context of understanding the gendered impacts as well. So that we have within the context of the project a section, as I described before, that will be about doing mains replacement, upgrades of reservoirs, and also as well replacement and also maintenance of water tanks, etc. So that we have a situation in the context of the resolution, Mr. President, that we are talking about now, where the Barbados Water Authority in particular is seeking to make sure that we reduce leakages and loss from what is called non-revenue water. And Mr. President, I'm going to be careful here because I've got to understand the terminology. And so non-revenue water is water that is produced and there is no revenue collected when it then reaches the consumer for a variety of reasons. So one of them can be leakage within the system. One of them can be poor billing, etc. So the attempt is that we have to make sure that we are efficient in the context of one seeking to be able to be careful with the water and the uses of the water. Because, Mr. President, and I'm going to be very frank here, some of us, again, different circumstances may arise, but we may not always prioritize the need to consistently, on a monthly basis, pay our water bills for whatever reason, Mr. President. There are some within the society that might not legitimately be able to pay, but there are some who just refuse to pay because it is one of those things that are not seen as a priority. But that has impact because paying the water bills allows then the Barbados Water Authority to continue to be able to carry out the necessary repairs, to continue then, Mr. President, to be able then to upgrade the systems that it needs to be able to do, and to make sure that it is functioning efficiently. So that responsibility for all of us, responsibility for all of us to be able to ensure that we are paying the water bills and then allowing the Barbados Water Authority as well to use the money efficiently. And that is another pillar of the work that is being done in the context of the Barbados Water Authority and improvement of efficiencies, is seeking to measure this non-revenue water, seeking to ensure that it improves its billing as well, dealing with the issues of leakages, etc. So that in the context, Mr. President, of the surface reservoirs at Balls, Christchurch, we have a situation in which the existing Rising Sun reservoir at Balls was erected many decades ago. I don't know how many decades ago, but long, 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 Mr. President. And it was erected to facilitate water supply to customers. And its function is to maintain the distribution system to which it is connected, and also as well to satisfy fluctuations in demand, especially at peak times. And Mr. President, I was noting in another discussion this whole issue of peak times, and really it is about ensuring that the system will have enough in it in order to meet the demand when it is at the highest. Yeah? So that particular reservoir was there in order to be able to satisfy particularly customers on the south coast of the island, including Packers, St. Patrick's, Yorkshire, Waldron's, Lothars, Searles, Fairview, Watton, Charnox, Corvelly, Grantley Adams Industrial Park, Grantley Adams International Airport, Fair Valley, Parishland, and I could go on, Kingsland, Silver Hill. So you'll see the importance, Mr. President, of that particular reservoir in serving a large portion of customers in the Christchurch area. I don't know where the leader of government business is stressing on that on the Christchurch area, but I'm happy to note that we had to make sure, that there are efforts to make sure that there's adequate supply to those persons who live in that particular area of the island. And mostly, Mr. President, again, because of the population density as well, so we had the specific erection of that reservoir within that area. So that the existing Sunrise Reservoir at Balls, Christchurch, Mr. President, is one of the areas that is earmarked for rehabilitation under the Water Supply Network Upgrade project. And based on the nature of the work that is required for its repair, it has to be decommissioned, resulting that it will be taken offline for a period of 4 to 5 months. So, Mr. President, if you decommission that particular reservoir, which I explained, service quite a large population in the south of the island, what happens then? How will customers, as I've described previously, Mr. President, be sure that they will have demand, particularly in the context of peak times? And remember that one of the areas that I spoke to, St. Lawrence Gap, etc., lots of tourists, etc., within that particular population. So if we are decommissioning it for the necessary repairs, Mr. President, for the necessary repairs, then we must make sure that we have an alternative in order to be able to supply the residents. So that in the context of that decommissioning, the Barbados Water Authority is seeking to invest in the erection of an additional reservoir at the Balls Christchurch location prior to the decommissioning of the existing tank, in order to make sure so that we are trying to, on the one hand, address a situation, but recognizing that we need to make sure that we do not displace those residents by decommissioning without having an alternative in place at the same time. So the intent is to then to be able to construct this new reservoir that will then be able to supply the necessary water and will act as a buffer to really avoid severe impact of outages as well. It is proposed by the Barbados Water Authority that the new reservoir will, in the short term, maintain supply. So it's going to be able to maintain supply to those customers during the rehabilitation works. In the long term, it would also provide mitigation of water supply outages, which may be caused by issues within pumping or in maintenance, etc. Without this backup source, Mr. President, what we would have to rely on is that we would have to get water tankers to be able to come out to residents. I want to suggest, Mr. President, that water tankers are useful, but perhaps not the most efficient way in order to maintain consistent supply. Because very often we know that householders like myself from the Christchurch area, please and thank you, are not often home. Perhaps during those hours when the water tankers will come out. The amount of water that we can collect from those water tankers and all of those issues. So again, the Barbados Water Authority, in recognizing some of those deficiencies, is seeking to suggest that, the water tanker may not be the most efficient option in order to address the issues, and particularly for that population as well. And then I don't know, Mr. President, if you have recently, seen a water tanker that's distributing water. There's a lot of water that ends up on the ground. That's wastage, that's leakage, etc. So even in the context of attempting to supply, you are also then losing as well. And we note, Mr. President, that is also one of the things that needs to be measured in the context of the efficiency of supplying water through that means, through the water tanker. So that in the context of seeking to erect this new service reservoir to service those residents in the Southern District, we need to be able, Mr. President, to erect that somewhere, and the Barbados Water Authority, along with the Ministry of Housing and Lands, has identified the land in the context of the resolution to be able to erect that reservoir, Mr. President, for the service of those persons within the population. Mr. President, as I close, I want to just reinforce here that, the acquisition of land in this case is really for a public good in order to ensure that we can attend to one of the critical necessities of citizens in terms of maintaining water supply. There are many things, Mr. President, I am not going to say that again, that it is perfect, that needs correcting. We are working to be able to do so and to do so efficiently. And certainly the measure that we are taking here in terms of constructing another reservoir as we decommission one for repairs and upgrades is an attempt to make sure that we are proactive rather than reactive, rather than decommission it and then waiting 3 days in order to bring people some water, that we are going before in order to erect the tank in order to be able to serve the citizens. With those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged. Mr.
You need to move that resolution, it will pass.
Mr. President, I do not move, I do not beg that the resolution be now passed.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Moreno. Senator Dr. Rafford.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to all. Mr. President, as the government of Barbados seeks to roll out strategies for economic growth, modernization, improve human resources, improve infrastructure, and all the initiatives that we have seen over the last several years. I wish to take the opportunity to congratulate the government on its efforts to provide water as an important resource and a basic necessity for development in our country. I have said before, and I'll say it again, that food, water, energy, and health are the critical building blocks for the future development of our country. In addition, of course, Mr. President, to security and social stability. But there can be no question that water as a resource and as a commodity will be vital to us going forward. And this is critical not only in the context of existing infrastructure, but in the context of government plans, for example, to expand the housing stock of our country. Every new house requires water. Water for domestic consumption, water for toilets, water for all the domestic activities that are associated with an expanding housing stock. Water is also critical for an expanded agricultural sector, if in fact we are to do something serious about our food insecurity. And so, Mr. President, any effort to improve the water supply for domestic or commercial use in our country must be supported and applauded. Mr. President, there's a myth, in my view, a myth, in circulation that we are a water-scarce country. And that may be true for those who do the analyses on a global stage and a global level, and who use criteria such as amount of rainfall on an annual basis as a basis for this classification. I personally do not believe that we are a water-scarce country. Most water-scarce countries do not have the kind of floods that we have. The flooding that occurs in our country could be a wake-up call to some of us that we're not that water-scarce. What happens in a lot of situations is that we do not collect and capture the water that falls on the land, and the water flows into the sea. And then, Mr. President, we put technology in place to bring that water from the sea back to the land. It seemed to me, Mr. President, that the whole concept that we are water scarce have influenced our thinking and our policies. The government has been putting in place dams for providing water to the agricultural sector. Noble initiative. But that noble initiative and those noble initiatives, Mr. Chairman, must be expanded and must be expanded to the extent that we can get to the stage where we do not use domestic water supplies that have been treated with chlorine to irrigate our crops. Plants don't like chlorine. And if we can get fresh water falling from the skies and capture it to irrigate our crops, we'll be much better off. I believe, therefore, that efforts such as those that are being made are commendable. And I hope that more of the funding that has been approved under the BERT 2 and under the Green Climate Fund and all the other financial instruments that are being put in place will be used to secure better water supplies so that they can we can in fact satisfy domestic requirements, commercial requirements, and agricultural requirements in our country. Because at the end of the day, if water is a limiting factor, our development is going to be constrained. Our development is going to be affected. Housing, industrial development, food production will be constrained if there is not sufficient water. And so I hope that going forward, this will remain a priority of the government, that the government will see it fit to expand the development of dams and micro dams in our country, to support the agricultural sector, to ensure that farmers have adequate amounts of water for their production, because without water, agriculture, conventional agriculture is almost impossible, and that we will do all we can to ensure that in providing water, we change the paradigm of our development, where we move from being so dependent. In some countries where water scarcity is recognized as an important factor, individual responsibility is also an important part of the solution, where people take individual responsibility for water harvesting, harvest their own water supplies to supplement what is provided by government. Catchment of water for washing cars, for wetting the garden, are important contributors to augmenting what government can do. And I think the time may come, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, when we must emphasize the importance of individual responsibility in the management of water, not wasting what we have, managing it carefully as any other resource to ensure that we have enough to satisfy the basic requirements needed for the development of our country. With these few words, Mr. President, I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will be very brief, but I also want to support comments of Senator Brathwaite. I have been hearing this concept that we are water scarce now for many, many years. And it takes me back to 1986 in particular. I'll never forget it. I went to St. Croix for the very first time, 1986. And I remember when I was there, they were using desalinated water from the sea. And I thought to myself, well, this is novel for me as a young person traveling and seeing it for the very first time. I remember coming back home and going to the water authority then to speak to, I think the person was basically more of a promotional person with them at that time. And I said, you know, I just came back from St. Croix, and this is what's happening, and I understand Barbados is in top 50 water scarce places in the world. He said to me at that time, I remember it like it was yesterday, he said to me that it would be too expensive to have a desalination plant. My question then, as it is till today, is what price do you put on people's lives? How much is too much to ensure that people have access to water? And so the work that is being undertaken at this particular point in time is extremely important. And I dare say, I will challenge some of the people who speak a lot on this particular subject to take a walk or a drive around this country to see the amount of springs that they have that have been running for centuries. Not yesterday or the day before or for 2 weeks. They have been running for centuries and continue to run. And I've heard over and over that it is not enough to sustain the whole of Barbados. And that might be true. But I also see people going to those springs and removing water every possible day. Some with huge trucks and cans, moving loads of water to do whatever it is, or God knows what they do with it. And the point that was made earlier about our inability to capture and store water on a national level and on an individual level is also, again, extremely important. And I believe that the time has come where the naysayers, because you're gonna always have naysayers. People say, oh, this can't be done, and the next can't be done, and the next can't be done. It is ironic that when you have small island states like ours, people on the outside are extremely quick to tell you, you cannot do this, you cannot do the next, and you cannot do the third. Yet these same people will not explain to me how come in the middle of the deserts in Dubai and other places that I've had the opportunity to travel to, there's no scarcity of water. In the middle of a desert, in the middle of the Las Vegas desert, there's no scarcity of water. In Israel, where it's supposed to be desert land, people are growing crops, and it's one of the major exporters of olive oil. We got water to feed plants. So what is it that we are saying to ourselves, or what is it that people are trying to get us to believe? That we are incapable of taking care of our own water problem? I dare say no. And I see this as part of those steps to correct that particular mindset. Our problem has been for too long our inability to think for ourselves, to think things through, and to really examine why people say the things that they say. And you know, I might be a different breed, Mr. President, because all of my life, the more people tell me I cannot do something, the more I want to do it. That is just how I am made up as an individual. I believe more people need to take that kind of stance. Because the people who obviously keep telling you you cannot do something, most of the times they see something in you that they want to suppress or hold back, keep you in a particular position. So that on this particular issue, when I listen to some of these calling programs, and you hear people saying, oh, we can't do this and we can't do the next where water is concerned, and we can't do this and we can't do the next, and it can cost so much money. And what are you saying? You rather have a problem on your hands that can cause serious problems in terms of health, without access to water, well-being, and all of these kind of things. And then the other thing that I also got challenged with, and I probably, again, might be one of a kind, but what's this whole thing? That everybody believes that their car must look spotless every morning. To do what? To move from point A to point B. So you have a problem with water, but every morning everybody got to wash their car spotless to drive from point A to point B. When you know, or you claim, or you believe that you have a water problem. This, in my mind, makes absolutely no sense. None. Explain to me which is more important. You having access to water for crops, and for you to have a bath, and for your own health, or for a piece of metal that is going to drive you from point A to point B. I mean, these things, I find these things astounding. But, Mr. President, that is just me, and I hope that the naysayers will see this for what it is, and how important it is that at this particular point in time, that we get this right, where making sure that that reservoir is sorted out. And with those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too will be brief. Mr. President, it is really good that this government is continuing to do all the positive things that it has been doing to supply the citizens of this country with water. I do not only mean for residential use, but I mean for the farming community. Now, I'm sure that there'll be other times when we'll be able to debate water to a much greater extent. And that statement is based on promises made, and I expect them to be kept. Mr. President, last time I stood in this chamber at the last sitting, I said that the Barbados Water Authority had, in my opinion, become more of a purchaser and distributor of water than a producer of water. And if you follow its history over the years, long before desalination and the increase in the number of private wells and the water augmentation project in St. Philip, the Barbados Water Authority produced most of its own water. And what the average household cares about is not all of the talk and the politics, but what it will cost them for water. And yes, Barbados is listed as a water-scarce country, and I will not argue whether it is or isn't, and if it's in the right position on the scale in terms of the world listing or not. But what I will say is that the cost that we pay for water is largely determined by the cost of production. Now, the biggest input in production of water is energy. And I saw what I regard as a business stroke of billions in St. Philip. I saw the establishment of a number of wells in the water augmentation project, in case you have seen it, as you leave 6 Roads. A number of years after all the pumping equipment was in and running, lo and behold, a large photovoltaic system was put down. And I asked myself this question: when that facility was planned, did the planners and the government of the day think about the cost of production and whether the unit charge per meter of water which we'll be paying could have been reduced if that plant was factored into it? I do not know what the exact arrangements are, whether there is going to be a reduction in the cost or whether it will just mean more profits for those who are pumping the water. But it pains me. And I asked, well, here we are debating a resolution to set up a new reservoir that is now supposed to serve a population that has grown massively since Rising Sun Reservoir was built. I live not far away. I grew up not far away from there. And what is now Chancery Lane Development, Corvally, as far as you can see with landing aircraft, used to be canes. They're all now houses. And yes, there have been attempts by a BLP administration, interestingly, under the Owen Arthur government, to insist on conservation by requiring houses over 1350, I think it's 1350 square feet of floor space, to having a water tank. There's been no serious effort, and I say that, I repeat that, no serious effort to have the population use the water from those tanks in a sustainable way. They have largely become sources for places for mosquitoes to breed in and cause dengue. And I hope that in time, the government will bring legislation to Parliament that will allow persons to use that water in an orderly fashion for flushing their toilets and not only washing their cars. Now, Mr. President, on the same topic of cost of water, we pay a lot of money for desalinated water. And I happen to have been able to find a document that dealt with the original contract for desalination. And it was an eye-opener. I was really amazed to see some of the detail, and I suspect we were over a barrel because we needed the water, where the contract issued was for water, a maximum output that we could not use. So we were paying for water that we were not using. So the company was profiting for something that they weren't doing. But then within the details of the contract, we had matters like the company did not pay taxes on its, the company was able to write off in the following year taxes on profits of the previous year. And I asked, well, certainly, I said to myself, certainly that increases the cost of the water. And as we are supposed to increase our level of desalination to supply the needs of the country, I wonder whether such things would be removed from consideration so we can keep the cost down. And then there's the begging question. I look at it in a medical sense. If we have a patient who is bleeding and he has a severed vessel, do you run blood into that patient as much as you can get from the blood bank, or do you stop the bleeding? And maybe you have to do both. So when I look in the north of the island and there are problems with water supply, and there is talk about desalination to increase the level, amount of water, one has to ask, well, should you not replace the mains? And Senator Monroe Knight spoke of water for which you did not receive monies, and she called it non-revenue water. Certainly, there's a lot of non-revenue water around from the old pipes that are leaking. And then there are other causes of it too, people who are not paying their bills and people who are having illegal connections. Now, But there are other problems, Mr. President. It's claimed, and I've not seen the test data, that the water in the north is becoming increasingly higher in its saline content. There is saline ingress into the wells in the north. And one has to ask, why is it happening? Why are we having more saline? Are we pumping more water from these wells? Or is it that the aquifer has been damaged? Is it leaking out? Have you opened it? There's an accusation that a recent construction of a facility in the north opened the aquifer into a lagoon. Those things, Mr. President, have important national significance because the consequences are not short-term, and they're not going to end in 5 days. When you get saline ingress into your water system, to your groundwater, it doesn't go away. And every time we add a desalination plant, there's increased costs because there's cost of production, there's equipment, there's all the things that go with it, and the energy, the continuous input of energy. And the consumer will have to pay more. Now, there was a hint, I think, in Senator Monroe Knight's introduction about water reuse, and I'm not going to anticipate or be accused of anticipating in this chamber, but Mr. President, there is a lot of water that is poured into the sea in this country every day. On most days when we flush our toilets, the water goes out somewhere and is not reused, but it has a value. And I believe that the government needs to, with haste, if it's not already done so, seriously bring into force all of the legislation that will allow water reuse. Now, Mr. President, I want to comment a little bit further on cisterns and houses, because most of us who've taken the pleasures of traveling around the Caribbean would know that in some parts of the Caribbean, there are elaborate structures that people live in that have no municipal water supply. And the water supply to that property is managed on the property. And yes, there's no reverse osmosis plants on those properties. They have cisterns that catch water from the roof and they reuse it. But the technology in the world has changed so much that one can supply drinking water to a house from small plants. And Senator Braffitt's suggestion that households be responsible in some way for their own supply of water, not all of it, is an excellent one. And there needs to be a concerted public education campaign, not only about the value of water and water conservation, but how you as an individual must provide some sources, must provide some of your own water, not necessarily potable water, but water that can be used for other purposes. Mr. President, I recently had contact with the mother of one of my colleagues, who is 89, and we were talking about exercise and staying fit at 89. And she said to me, but you know, I do not, my washing machine, the tap to my washing machine only gets turned on when my daughter uses the washing machine. So I said, yeah, that's reasonable. You're 89, she does the washing. She said, no. I do most of the washing. But I bring the water from the tank outside that's connected to the roof and put it in the machine. I said, well, how long does that take you? She says, I fill up 2 5-gallon buckets and I carry them and put them in. And she's been doing that all the time. This elderly lady has continued to use the water from the tanks that her husband set up when he was alive and he had a garden. At 89, she's to be commended. If we all used some of the water that fell from on our roofs and we collected it, our water bills would be lower. and the country will have to spend less. And the money we have to spend on the infrastructure will probably be less. So we have to start looking in a different direction. A lot more conservation and probably less production. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Any other speakers? Your Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. There are notes that other speakers before me have struck which really allow for a natural segue into my own comments. I want to start, however, at the point at which Senator Dr. Monroe Knight took her opening comments, and that is that Barbados is the 15th most water scarce country in the world. Barbados is the 15th most water scarce country in the world. I repeat it because I do not think that this is a reality with which the majority of the Barbadian public connects. That we say it in these places and at this level, but it does not inform individual behavior or attitude in the way we consume and use water and in our personal practices relative to preservation. This is a problem. Yes, there is aging infrastructure, undoubtedly. I remember becoming Minister of Environment, and that is the 1994, now a long time ago. This is when the first consultants' evaluations were conducted on the Water Authority. The first modern ones, very extensive evaluations. And that is when we learned for the first time that of the 40% unaccounted for water in the system, that the pipes were so old and leaky that the water was just gushing out of it in various places. I remember the Barbados Water Authority spending a lot of time and technical energy denying it. They said it just could not be true. And they themselves, after years of investigation, have now come to the point where they accept that there's a problem with unaccounted for water. Thankfully, since 1994, there have been consistent attempts to address this problem. But the reality is that we are fighting on every front in relation to having fresh water for the national population. We are fighting because water is integral to public health. It is particularly important to sanitary conditions for girls and young women. There are countries in the world, particularly Islamic countries, in which young girls cannot go to school because there is not either electricity, there's not energy, or there is not water. And they don't have bathroom facilities that are separated and so on. So that is a critical problem, a critical issue. It is integral to our national food security plans and aspirations. It is critical just for cooking and normal activities of daily life. But because Barbados has had a pipe-borne system since the 19th century, way before the rest of many islands in the Caribbean, we have just taken it for granted that you can turn the tap on, whether that tap was inside your house, or whether that tap was inside your yard, or whether it was immediately in your community. There's always been some aspect of pipe-borne water within Barbados, and therefore we take it for granted that what has happened will always happen when global circumstances have changed. Senator Monroe Knight also indicated what our rainfall was. She didn't do the division per capita, per head, per person, relative to the number of inches or the number, relative to the number of inches centimeters that fall so people can hear the numbers. But the reality is we are water scarce in Barbados, not just water stress, but water scarce. It is critical to, I said it was integral, it is also critical to our development efforts, sanitation and public health. We have a tourism industry that we are seeking to grow. A population of about 270,000 people resident, but a visiting population, for want of a better word, or visitors, which can rise to as high as 1 million in the course of a year. So really, I beg your pardon? 1.2 million. So that your population, your water supply, isn't just serving your resident population of 270,000 people, it is really catering to 270,000 plus 1.2 million per annum. That is what you have to produce water for. And people don't think about that, because every tourist has to bathe, they too want to wash their cars, as Senator John was telling us, and so on. So that is the numbers for which we are catering. And we are seeking to grow our tourism numbers. It is central to development. You go around the island now, you see large new buildings going up, new malls going up. You see new housing developments being constructed. We hear about the Hope Project. We are hearing about all of these new commercial developments that are going to come to the country, all of which are going to require a potable water supply, and a water supply which meets the needs and the demands of the people who are going to be visiting these facilities, whether they are malls or cinemas or hotels or restaurants. And that is another thing. We have a large number of restaurants in Barbados, and we are accustomed to high public health standards. So whether it is the people selling snow cones and juices on the highway, the coconut vendors who now have water there that they're washing their hands and washing off the coconuts and washing the bottles and all of that before they give them to you. Whichever restaurant you go to in Barbados, from Muster to This Old House to Tides, and I like to eat around, sir, whichever, to Village Shop, Shiraz in St. Lucie. I know that Senator Anduele goes there from time to time as well. But whether you are in a village shop, or old traditional cook shop, or an upscale restaurant, whether it is QP or Cliff, and I know some people in here like the Cliff. Yes, and she's smiling. I'm being introducing an element of levity, but the reality is that every night at these restaurants, which are now full, because wherever you go in Barbados, people are going out. You could hardly get into Lara Court on Sunday evening for carols by candlelight. And I thank the Rotary for the donations that they're going to make to charitable causes in Barbados. And the Rotarians are applauding, as well they should, so I recognize that Senator Cummings is a Rotarian, but there was not, you could hardly see a blade of grass in Lara Court for the number of people who were there. So, and all of these people had to have access, well not all, but access to bathroom facilities and so on. So wherever you go, wherever you see activity, there is a commensurate demand for water. And we don't think about it. We take it for granted that we will be able to go into bathrooms, and these days even the mobile toilets, what do they call them? Mobile toilets? Even the portable toilets, the porta potties, people now expect that routinely they will flush and that they will have water and soap for washing their hands and so on. This is now routine, and certainly since COVID, we are placing even greater emphasis on hand washing and so on. There is the fact that we are talking about food and nutrition security and about investing in an agricultural product of which we can be proud and which will produce enough food for Barbadians to become relatively self-sufficient, cut our food import bills, and cut our reliance on supply chains that we know now are not as secure as we may have previously thought. So your agricultural sector also needs water. We are encouraging young people to get into agriculture. Every farmer, whether it's animal husbandry that you are into, or whether you are growing food crops, water is essential. So we have these multiple demanding and competing interests for a commodity, for water, in a society that takes water use and water access and water availability for granted. And in a wider global society where the impacts of climate change, the warming of the climate is making desertification, the drying out of the soils, and the difficulty in growing crops far more severe. Where the water, although in the last few months we've really had quite a lot of rain, but generally where it is hot and dry, and even when it is raining in recent times, it has been unbearably hot. So that we have to come to terms with the reality that what we accepted as being an infinite supply being available to us really has limits on its availability. And that requires us to deal with our own behaviors. I was very impressed with the 89-year-old lady, Senator Dr. Maynard, who is catching her 2 5-gallon buckets of water to fill up her washing machine. And I don't know if I want to live that long, but if I do, I want to be filling my washing machine at that time, to have the mental and physical capacity to do it. So God bless her. And perhaps we can learn from her example. There are people, Senator Dr. Knight spoke about turning off the water while she is brushing her teeth. A lot of us keep the water running. We turn the shower on, and while the water is warming up, we run around and do all kinds of things. I see some senators smiling. And as we are running around and doing those things, the phone rings and we stop to take the phone call. And 15 minutes later, we're on the phone trying to deal with whatever it is that we think is very important. Meanwhile, the water is running. We go out of the room, we leave the electricity on, and there is a nexus. You need water to help with your electricity product, and you need electricity to help to pump and distribute your water. So energy and water supply are interconnected in a very significant way, and that is a connection that a lot of people also do not make. In fact, it has become one of the major issues in fracking, because of the amount of water that is being used in communities where fracking is taking place. Fracking, for the general public who may be unaware, is a means of getting oil and most usually gas out of a reservoir where you're using large volumes of water at high pressure, really, essentially to flush it out or up to the surface. So that has endangered the water supply of communities and caused environmental damage. So that is another big global issue, or issue in communities where fracking is being used in a significant way, particularly in the United States, which has boosted its domestic energy supply through its fracking and the result of fracking. So government in Barbados, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but I was speaking about personal habits. I know one family, and they have developed a very interesting thing. When they turn the water on, to have their shower in that initial period when the water is very cold. A bucket is placed in the shower to catch that runoff. And that runoff, everybody who goes in puts, you put it in and out, and that water is used then to wet the plants indoor the house. And if some is left over, then it is poured on plants that are outside. But it reduces their water bill while at the same time catching water which would otherwise be wasted. There is one family that says to me, and I'm not sure how many people would be willing to adopt this, that they have a bathroom at their house and not several bathrooms. And if the family uses the bathroom during the hours of the night, and there are number ones, the bathroom is not flushed. So that in the morning, after everybody has used the bathroom during the night, the water is flushed at that time. I can't say that I'm so enthusiastic about that one at a personal level, but it works for them. And you will appreciate that it also reduces costs. Because if you have 5 or 7 family members and it takes 2 gallons or whatever to flush, I don't know what that will work out at, but I imagine that the cost does mount up. And the point that I want to make here is that really we have to start thinking at the personal level. We have to get personal about it. How do we use water? Water is scarce. What is the level of my individual responsibility as a citizen and a consumer of water to address that scarcity? Is there some way that I now use or misuse the water supply that comes to me, that I take for granted, that I can change, and by so changing, help the country to have more water over the course of a year, or help another citizen who may be in St. Thomas? And I live in St. Thomas, so I know about scarcity of supply. We have had to get a tank just to be sure that we have access to water every day. And that is true in some parishes in Barbados. So if you could help somebody who cannot afford a tank to have water, then let us do that as citizens. Let us understand that as circumstances change, our behaviors need to change with them. And we cannot pretend that there is another, we cannot disconnect from the reality which the policymakers are telling us they have to struggle with. And there is also the element of cost, because addressing water issues is very, very high cost. The infrastructure is high cost. So what is the level of personal responsibility? What are the habits you can cultivate or stop that will make a difference? And what is your payment pattern? And I want to pause to make 2 points about payment for water. People have complained that water costs in Barbados are high, but the reality is that water costs were low for a very long time, and that perhaps there is now an attempt to bring them in line with what it really costs to produce, supply, and distribute water, and to keep and upgrade and maintain infrastructure. But I represented a constituency that taught me something about the way people use water in Barbados. There are people and there are communities in Barbados where people, their electricity is never cut off because they pay light and power. There, before, in the days when they had cable TV from various places, their TV was always on because they're going to play Flow and Digicel and CBC and whoever else is the supplier of entertainment. But they would not pay government for water. And so you will find that people living in certain places run up water bills of like $10,000, $5,000, that commercial entities are allowed to run up bills of $50,000 and $60,000 and more, and all water authorities a significant amount of money, but they don't own light and power. They do not own light and power because they know that if you miss the first month, you can't step in the second because the electricity will be cut off. But government will let it run up till it gets to 5 figures and 6 figures. And I'm saying this is absolute nonsense on both sides. It is ridiculous on the part of those who take the supply of water for granted and will not pay their water bills, but will pay for their entertainment, they will pay for their phones, they will pay for electricity, but they will not pay BWA because it is a government agency and they think that they have the right to get water without paying for it. I remember a whole block in an area that I represented fell out with me for that. I would never forget it. I was at Parliament on Tuesday, and I got a call that several houses in a particular area, the water had been cut off, people were out on the streets up in arms, the press was down there, and I had to go because I was being summoned by my constituents. And I went down, I went from house to house, and I asked the same questions. Is everybody in the house working? Is there a problem? Is your TV on? Because if the TV on, the electricity on. And I asked about all of the services. There were very few houses where there were people who were unemployed, and in the majority of the houses, all of the utilities, all of the other utilities and entertainments were fully paid up. And so when they asked me, and what you propose to do about this here? I said to them, pay the so-and-so water. And I dressed, I might turn around, and I came back to, yes, and I was not going to church at that time. Yeah, you don't need to pray for rent. Pay the so-and-so water. And I turned, came back to the, and sat down. Because what I saw was a pattern that was abusive. And I went back to the individual households, tried to counsel them, engage with them, work out payment plans with Water Authority for them. Because, I mean, you have to slap where you go hug up. You have to learn to do both. And so after the slap, I gave the hug up. You did the wrong thing. I can't encourage you. You have to pay, but here's how we were going to do it. And the majority of people, we were able to work through the problems, but like I said, I lost some support. But on principle, I was not going to be one of the MPs who was being seen or heard to say to constituents that they had no responsibility to the country and that they had no responsibility to pay when they in fact did. To the Water Authority, I say you have a responsibility to run your operation like a serious business. You cannot expect that the few people who are paying should be made to carry the burden of those who are then going to owe you 5 and 6 figures in debt. Because if you don't collect it when it is a small sum, how do you expect to collect it when it is a large sum? And I believe that we have come to the stage where if we look at all of those people in communities who are now not working, who may owe, to sit down and work out long-term payment plans with them, give them some reconnection, see how they're paying and so on, and nurture them along so that we don't create another problem, because these people are using, you know, without being able to flush properly, and they're collecting water elsewhere, and then you can have illegal connections and connections being breached and all kinds of things. So we need to be conscious of that. I want to commend the government for this initiative, which is part of a wider approach that this administration since 2018. And if you think about it, it's really been just short 4 years. The tremendous amount of effort that the government has made to supply water to the people of Barbados, particularly those in communities like St. Joseph, like parts of St. James, like St. Thomas, and I think parts of St. Andrew that were the worst impacted by water shortages. There has been multiple loans and grants to deal with things such as wastewater upgrades. And sir, I also want to make the point that we have to utilize the technology. We have soared the South Coast. We've been talking about soaring the West Coast for years. It hasn't been done. And there are countries like Singapore where they have moved from primary treatment to secondary treatment to tertiary to what you can only call super tertiary, because they are now able to take the water and use it for potable, after treatment, for potable purposes, cooking, bottling, and it is constantly tested to guarantee quality, and the quality is excellent. Technology is not beyond us, so we really have to look at utilization of the technology in order to ensure that we have adequate supply of water for all purposes and uses. There's been the upgrade of the Bridgetown plant from primary, I think, to secondary, and maybe they're moving to tertiary. There has been increased water. I think this particular initiative is intended to guarantee increased water for agriculture. There has been an effort to replenish the aquifers of Barbados. A 60,000-gallon tank, I think, has either been provided or is being provided for the Queen Elizabeth Hospital to ensure them water in circumstances of crisis or when water is cut off. Funding was agreed for the replacement of 20 kilometers of water mains. Staff training has been done, new tankers purchased. We know that desalination plants and other supporting facilities are going at St. James and St. Peter to augment supply for St. James, St. Joseph, and St. Thomas. So there has been a comprehensive approach to the challenge that is water supply in a water scarce country in an era of climate change. But I believe that as individuals, we must do what is right and what is fair to the country and play our part as Barbadians. In other words, pay the people water bill. And the Water Authority must give proper service, must treat citizens with courtesy and respect, must respond to the notion of leakages. We had a leak in my community. I called Water Authority for 3 weeks. And it was only when I went to the chairman of the board and the general manager directly, which nobody should have to do. There has to be a system in place when a leak is reported that somebody goes out to investigate it, and within 24 to 48 hours, it is sorted. In a community where the water is off routinely, this water was pouring for days, and it went on for weeks, and we didn't know that it hadn't been repaired because it stopped. It only stopped because the water had been off. And when the water came back on again, we realized that nobody had come to repair this leak. So I'm trying to be fair to both sides. Government is doing a great deal of work. I'm proud of it. I commend it. I commend the ministers. In the implementation of these things and in the management of the institutions responsible for them, there can be, I don't want to say breaches, but failings, which really almost negate the good that is being done. And at the same time, we as a people must not believe that we can take what we have for granted. Much obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Your Honour, Senator Thompson. The speakers, Senator Dr. Morrow Knight.
Mr. President, thank you. As I rise, I want to thank all of the honourable senators that would have contributed to this discussion. I believe that there is some consensus around the whole notion of personal responsibility and the need for all of us at the level of our households to ensure that we imbue the best practices for conservation, being able to make sure that we implement the things that we all know that we should, the things that we grew up hearing about in terms of conserving the water, and that really are going to be important to us and this island, being able to ensure that we have a water supply service that maintains the level of quality and the efficiency of supply that is needed, Mr. President. I want to note, Mr. President, in particular, that under the project that I spoke about that the government is implementing, and this has to do specifically with the Water Nexus Resilience and Sustainability Project, that one of the aspects of that is actually, Mr. President, the establishment of a revolving fund. And this fund, Mr. President, is intended to facilitate for citizens an uptake in water efficiency devices at the household level for things like dual flush toilets and aerated faucets at home. And so far, the BWA has completed the guidelines for these things, and hopefully will be very soon being able to roll out this fund that will be available to households. So even as we are using suasion and education in order to be able, as we've all been speaking about, to encourage individual responsibility, the government is going even further than that, Mr. President, by actually putting in place this fund in order as well to act as an incentive and to make sure that cost is not an impediment in order to be able to address these issues. We've talked a lot here, and particularly Senator Dr. Maynard, just in relation to the issues of reuse in particular. And I want to say to him, he did not want to be seen to be forecasting ahead of what was coming, but certainly there is consideration to the development of legislation to treat with wastewater reuse. There is at this moment, and again under one of the projects that I mentioned, the beginning and looking at scoping studies, having discussions with stakeholders to just make sure that there is sufficient buy-in, etc. I'm reliably informed, Mr. President, that already at Coverley, and I understand that all of the lawns at Coverley are kept green because of a water reuse system, which takes all of the wastewater in Coverley and treats it and then redistributes it throughout the community. That there is a dual plumbing system and the pipes are color-coded so that there are specific ones that you would indicate that one, that color is for reused water, and this then is for the potable water. So we are seeing that the issue of water reuse and how we treat to that is something that is being heavily contemplated in the context, again, of ensuring that we have the nature of the level of supply that we'd want to as well. To Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite on the issue of water harvesting, which is extremely important. It is a critical strategy in the context of, again, ensuring water supply. We would want to note that it is, though, one piece of the puzzle. So yes, we can harvest the water, but again, we have to make sure that we use that water efficiently. as well. So there still has to be a nexus in the context of doing water harvesting. And as Senator Dr. Charlton Bradford would have indicated as well, making sure then that we align that with the relevant policies in terms of housing planning, etc. And also as well, again, critically, as we've all spoken to, the need for education as well, principally so that people can understand, yes, perhaps it is better to get the cucumbers and all of the thyme and everything in your backyard being watered directly from rainwater in particular. Mr. President, we talked as well, I think it was, again, Senator Dr. Maynard, just in terms of the cost as well of the provision of water. And I believe that there is a recognition that certainly the rates that were charged in the past when the government was responsible for setting the water rates were in no way commensurate to the production of the water. The government took an approach in order to be able to protect the most vulnerable and therefore used to subsidize the water authority, even in the context of the FTC now being responsible for the application of water rates. The FTC, in the consideration of those water rates, are guided by the fact that we're not having a water authority that is intended to make excess profits, but it's just kept at a level in order that it can assure efficient supply. But one of the considerations is whether or not the impact of climate change is being taken into consideration and how that now adds an additional layer in terms of the work that has to be done in the context of the water, authority. I want to thank Madam Deputy President, and I hope that she has been heard in the context of the responsibility of citizens and of politicians to ensure that the citizens and their constituents are well aware of their own personal responsibilities, as was said, to pay the water bill. That it is as critical as any of the other utilities that we use. We would prioritize, Mr. President, making sure that our cell phones are never going to be off, the electricity is never going to be off, but we don't necessarily treat to water in the same way. I believe that that point has been very well made, and it is one that we have to continue to be able to reinforce in the minds of citizens. On the one hand, that pillar that we are water scarce, and therefore we need to be able to conserve and use what we have efficiently. But then on the other hand as well, our responsibility as consumers as well to make sure that we pay for what it is that we use, and also as well, as we've heard again from Madam Deputy President, the responsibility from the Barbados Water Authority in order to be able to provide an efficient service. I want to say to Madam Deputy President that just a week ago I was sitting across from the table from the officials from the Barbados Water Authority as we were going through their commitment for results framework. And certainly one of the big areas that was considered was that of customer service. And they have taken that on board and are in the process of working through what does the metrics look like for improvement with the Barbados Water Authority of the delivery of their customer service and applying technological and other solutions, including, as I indicated before, upskilling of the staff as well to make sure that they are indeed responsive. Mr. President, again, I believe that we've had a fulsome discussion on this, and I believe that we have been able to bear out the critical issues having to do with these issues. And therefore, Mr. President, I do now beg that this resolution, in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, for the compulsory acquisition by the state of the parcel of land situated at Ball's Plantation in the parish of Christchurch, more particularly for a public purpose, namely the erection of a water storage tank by the Barbados Water Authority, be now passed.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This resolution is now duly passed.
Order number one, sir. Order number one, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate.
Order number 11. And on the order paper, reverting to questions to ministers.
No questions. Questions to ministers are recommitted.
The item is now recommitted. Under comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise on this occasion to respond to the question that has been on the order paper raised by Senator Dr. Christina Hines, specifically as it relates to the following questions, which I will read for the benefit of the Honourable the Senate, relating to the child protection legislation, the Juvenile Offenders Act, and the Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act. Mr. President, I wish to advise that formal written submissions will be made. However, in the interim, I would wish to give the following summary. The legislation about which we speak in these two items referred to here by the Honourable Senator actually relate to two new pieces of legislation which are about to be, in short order, laid in the other place. Mr. President, these two pieces of legislation relate to the Barbados Child Protection Act, which will stand on its own, and a separate piece of legislation which relates to the Child Justice Act bill, Mr. President. Those two drafts of the legislation will speak to the items listed here, the substantive issues raised in terms of whether or not they are going to be, one, introduced into Parliament. The time frame is within a relatively short space of time. I believe that in the submission of Senator Dr. Hines, there has been on more than one occasion reference to comments made in the press, and so it is known that imminently we will be making the necessary steps to lay the Child Protection Act, Child Protection Bill in the other place, as well as the Child Justice Bill as well. Now, Mr. President, I just want to take a few moments to be able to share that this has been an extensive process, which commenced over the course of the last cabinet and has continued into this cabinet. This is not a new matter. It is not a response to any recently asked questions. Neither is it a response to the currently constituted Senate as it now stands. In fact, it is work that started under the last Minister for People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, under a committee that was chaired by the now Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs as it relates to child protection. And we are now coming to the culmination of that work as it relates to, on the one hand, under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, the Child Protection Bill, and under the Ministry of Home Affairs, the matters relating to child justice, which are two separate ministries, two separate elements of jurisdiction, and two separate ministers. And I hope that once the substantive debate and the bills are laid, that all honourable members will have an opportunity to review the contents of the relevant bills and to follow on from there.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator Hines, supplementary questions?
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Cummins, for following this up and offering the response. I still am not clear, although I'm very happy to hear that this legislation is coming soon. That is not, in my understanding, a time frame. What does soon mean? Soon could be next month, next week, 6 months from now. I'm not certain. However, the question that I would like to ask is it that these two pieces of legislation will replace existing legislation altogether? So is that correct? We are expecting two new pieces of legislation that combined will replace what we had previously, the Juvenile Offenders Act 138 and the Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act. Will those be replaced altogether, or are these in addition to?
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So by way of background, Mr. President, let me first start by saying I don't have within my own control the work of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office, neither do I have within my own control the Office of the Attorney General, where the legislative drafters reside. And on that basis, the best I could offer anyone is, in due course, I will not be in a position to give a time frame that is satisfactory to anyone outside of that office. They and they alone will be in a position to determine when their drafting has been completed to a satisfaction that will not then result in many of the same people who would wish to have it here quickly then criticizing rushed work or inaccurate legislative drafting. So we will ensure that the complete body of work is done by the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. So again, I will repeat, it will be laid in this place in due course. Now, on the second part of the query, in terms of the repealing and the replace the Child Justice Act, about which we were not asked, will combine what we describe family legislation, and that family legislation will incorporate a number of the elements. When that bill is laid, you will then be in a position to see the substantive components of what is contained within there. But I would not, and I'm not sure that anyone here would expect me to begin to introduce a bill that has not yet even been laid in itself in the other place, and then to begin to explain and to share what is contained within that bill and how it relates to consequential amendments or the repealing of other pieces of legislation. But at best, at this stage, what I will say is that there has been a substantial body of work spanning 2 years at best, if not more, under the leadership of the current minister, started by the previous minister with responsibility for people empowerment and elder affairs alongside the Minister of Home Affairs, that is expected to culminate very shortly in a complete revision and suite of new legislation under the two headings that I have just shared.
Senator Hines.
Thank you.
Mr. President, sorry, I stand on,
On what do you rise?
sorry, on a matter of elucidation. I'm unclear as to the rules of the exchange. And if I could perhaps be
Order
guided.
17.
Which I checked. Thank you, Mr. President. Because I do note that we can ask questions that have been answered.
Standing Order 17.2 allows for, after the initial responses are given, for there to be supplementary questions. It just says that you can, and the questions are obviously will be relevant to the questions originally posed. You will not be able to introduce new material. New materials will be a matter for new questions, but yes, there'll be supplementary questions on the matters which are which have been posed, and that is what we have had so far. Senator Hines.
Thank you again, Mr. President. So to be clear, we do not know, is it that Senator Cummins is saying that we do not know whether the Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act will remain after the introduction of this legislation? Is that what we're saying? And are we further saying that the Juvenile Offenders Act will be replaced by one of these pieces of legislation? I am not clear from the response.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. What I am saying is that the Child Justice Bill that deals with offences will be laid in the other place, and at that time, the details of how it will treat to existing legislation, what will be repealed, what will be replaced, will be made clear. But I am not prepared, not because I don't know or don't want to. I do not think it is appropriate from this place to go into the details of legislation which has not been signed off on by the CPC, neither has it been laid in the other place, and to preempt the substantive debate on new legislation that is yet to be brought before this honourable chamber.
Senator Hines.
Thank you once again. I am going to belabor this point because it is the question. So I was informed that this was a response to the question. However, I received a response to A, which I appreciate, that there will be a child protection bill introduced soon, and that there will also be a child justice bill introduced. However, I am trying to find out if I will receive an answer to Part B of the question, because I do not believe that at this point I have received an answer. I have received that it is not appropriate to answer Part B. So I wonder what that means for my question.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think perhaps we disagree on the answer to the question, but the answer to the question is what it is, which is that Part B is meant to be subsumed, as I have said on the previous occasions, under new child justice legislation, which is separate and distinct from what you have raised. And at the time that the substantive bill is presented in the other place, that the details of what will be repealed and replaced will be advised in the course of the debate on that particular bill. And I'm not prepared, not because I don't want to, I am not willing in this instance to preempt the discussion on a substantive bill to give the Senate previous details on a bill that has not yet been laid. I would be very inappropriate if I were to do so. But what I can say and what I have said is that the child justice bill will treat to the substantive issues which you have raised in Part B.
Any further questions, Senator Dr. Haynes?
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe I exhausted my three, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Haynes, Senator Cummins, for that. Just thank you for the response to question number 1. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to This brings us to the end of government business for today. I wish to adjourn this sitting of the Senate to resume in its next sitting and its final sitting, we hope, for the year, next Wednesday. Wednesday, the 21st of December at 11 a.m.
Senator Dr. Bradford, speaking on the adjournment. On the adjournment.
Mr. President, I have tended in the past to be asked to make sure that I follow appropriate procedures. And since, in a real sense, I'm still trying to come to terms with the procedures and all the regulations and the standing orders, I just wanted to ask a question. May I?
It depends on the nature and the manner of the question. Every question is not a question. There are substantive matters being asked of ministers, for example. Represent a question to come under questions to ministers in the order paper of which notice is given and so on. But speaking on the adjournment, you can speak about anything. However, substantive matters that have their place in another part of the order paper need to find themselves there. So I will tell you if you can ask it after you've asked it, after you started.
Given all of that, Mr. President, then can I ask my question, which is, I assume, relevant and above board?
Yeah, well, what I will say to you in terms of general guidance is that, for example, the example given by Senator Dr. Haynes, where there was a specific inquiry being made of the government, then the route of questions which the clerks will give you guidance on. If it's in that nature, you proceed along that path. If it is not, it's a general matter for elucidation, then proceed.
Let me, Mr. President, with your permission, seek to put it along those lines. Some time ago, when I first entered the Senate, in my second meeting, I presented a motion where I presented the case to have the issue of food security in Barbados placed on the agenda of the Senate. The issue was presented, and subsequently I provided an explanation of the nature of the motion. My question, Mr. President, is this a matter that will be discussed in this chamber? In fact, it was presented and seconded in the chamber, and my understanding is that there would have been an opportunity for discussion and debate. I'm just raising it at this point in time to find out whether this is a matter that is on the agenda for discussion in the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. It is on the agenda. It is item number, and here it remains on the agenda, private members' business. Item number 1 under private members' business, the resolution was given June 1st. On August the 10th, Senator Bradford spoke. Further consideration of the resolution was postponed. So yes, it is on the agenda. Remember, during the months that you travel, October, I believe, October, November, when you were out, we would have wanted to have other senators speaking on the matter in your absence. Certainly with you back on the ground, the leader will schedule the time for the matter to be continued, of which naturally you will be given prior notice so that you can line up your other speakers and so on. But it's definitely on the agenda to be continued. Where consideration of a matter has been postponed, is not taken off the agenda. But there was a period during your absence on business that we would not have wanted to. There were a few days where there was room on the agenda, it could have been done. Since your return, that has not presented itself, but certainly that will be continued. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Dr. Charleston Brathwaite for not just raising it today, but also for introducing it in the first place. It is, in our view, as the government, an important body of work, and it is an important debate. And the Minister of Education and the Ministry of Agriculture, sorry, Minister of Agriculture and the Ministry of Agriculture officials have welcomed the submission. They also welcomed not just your written submission, your presentation of the booklets outlining your recommendations, but they also were in the process of preparing a substantive body of work that showed where the country has gone in the intervening years since you submitted that initial document and where it is now. And obviously, having postponed the initial consideration of the bill and everything else overtaking it over time, we very much now have to ensure that it is one of the things that we prioritize for a substantive debate and to finish continue the speeches on that matter very early in the new year, and you have that commitment from us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brathwaite and Senator Hines. The question is that this Senate be adjourned until Wednesday, December 21st at 11 a.m. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore adjourned until Wednesday, December 21st at 11 a.m.